Hello, my name's Emily. I'm an artist and jewellery maker and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is something I've been wanting to do for a very long time. I wanted a slightly more compact way of storing my watercolours. Sometimes when I'm doing the paintings, a lot of the colours are obsolete. For example, if I was doing a landscape, I wouldn't be using a lot of the really bright colours unless it was of like flower fields and whatnot. I also think it'd be a much easier way to store them as well, as we don't have a lot of room in the office. We both share the office in the bungalow, so I am slowly taking over with art supplies. But if I'm honest, they're far prettier than maths books. But on to my organisation process and how I've arranged all my watercolours. So the first palette is one that I've wanted to do for a while, and it's a portraiture palette. Daniel Smith's Buff Titanium. And I love this shade. In fact, I'm running low. I am in need of another Buff Titanium. I'm thinking of going for the Roman Szmal, but I'm not too sure whether to go for the full pan or the half pan, but the amount that I use it, I probably will just go for the full pan. I then have Sennelier Naples Yellow. Probably my most used yellow is Naples Yellow. It's got that creamy consistency. It can also be built quite nicely for portraiture and also botanical pieces as well. I then have the Old Holland Naples Reddish, which is a perfect sort of Caucasian skin tone colour. I also, again, love this for botanical pieces, like a really peachy sort of colour. It's also great for undertones and highlights on a deeper complexion as well. It's a really beautiful shade. I then have two Beyond Indigo shades. The first shade, Peach Haze, is definitely a bit more gouache. It has a really beautiful opacity and that sort of creaminess. And then the Beyond Indigo shade in Burnt Coral is slightly more transparent, but I would want that for this sort of colour because I want to use this for almost like blushes, highlights, and I think it'll be a really lovely way to sort of blend, but with a colour. I then have the Sennelier Warm Grey, which is a perfect cooler Buff Titanium, but not quite as cool as a typical grey. I, again, use this a lot and could probably do with another one. It's looking a bit deformed in the pan. We then have another Beyond Indigo shade, and it's very similar to the Peach Haze in the sense it's got a beautiful viscosity to it. So again, it resembles something like a gouache, but does have that sort of blendability and transparency similar to a watercolour as well. It's absolutely gorgeous. Perfect for facial contours. And then the Schminke Permanent Carmine. I love this sort of hue because you could add a little bit of a more orangey tone to get a bit more of a truer, almost vermilion-esque red. But then the pink is something that I would use more in portraits, especially for things like lips and whatnot. The Sennelier Caput Mortem is a very similar tone to the Beyond Indigo Putty, but it has a lot more of a transparency and a very different consistency. So I could probably water this one down a lot more as something to layer over the top, whereas I think the Beyond Indigo would definitely stand its own due to that transparency. But I like to have both of these tones because of the way that they perform is so different. And it is a colour I commonly use. I then have the Roman Szmal Hematite. There's a few different variations in Roman Szmal of the Hematite. I think I've just chosen the generic one, but this one has a lovely granulation to it, and it has that really almost ochre, burnt sienna warmth to it, which again, perfect for deeper complexions. But also I love this for like amber eyes, and I don't really do much else when it's an eye sort of colour. It works really well as almost that glassy, beautiful sort of look. And then I have the Sennelier Ultramarine Pink, very transparent. It does take quite a lot of building, but I think that is great for an undertone. If you're doing a really fair, milky complexion, having this as an undertone works so well to bring that coolness into the skin. I then have Old Holland King's Blue, again, a very well used shade. Great for eye colour, but similar to the Ultramarine Pink, I would use this as a base layer to give that impression of a really pale complexion. I then have the Beyond Indigo Eucalyptus. It's kind of in between the putty and burnt coral sort of consistency. It's not quite as gouache as putty, but it has a bit more opacity than burnt coral, but it does have the really soft, easy to layer, very buildable formula, which I really like. And again, perfect for more neutral undertone underneath the skin. So when you're not quite going for the milky complexion, but not quite going for a really warm, orangey, ochre complexion. I then have the Old Holland Terra Vert. I don't know whether mine's gone a bit funky because it's a lot more viscous than I first thought. It might be the binder. It's always been a very sheer shade, which is what I've liked for portraits, but I think the actual formulation has maybe gone a bit funky in the pan because it's quite an oily consistency now, which is very reminiscent of that binder that they use. But gorgeous colour. I like this, again, similar to the eucalyptus as an undertone just to bring to the skin, especially on paler complexions. but it's also great for highlights and an eye colour. I then chose the Winsor & Newton Professional Van Dyke Brown. I've not actually used this one much at all. As you can see, the pan is almost pristine, but I needed something that was a bit more, not quite sepia, had a bit more of a warmth to it, a mustard sort of tone, again for complexions but also eye colour. I think as well for contours of the skin, I think this would work really well when I'm not wanting something more taupey like putty, but something a bit warmer but not quite orange, if that makes sense. I then chose the Schminke neutral tint because I don't always like to use a black for portraits. I think if I was going to use a black, I'd use that in a pencil form, but as a layer I like the neutral tint because it has that mauvey purple tone to it and it just looks a little bit less harsh on the skin sort of complexion. But you can also build it up to be quite dark as well. And then chose the Winsor & Newton, it's not the Professional Chinese White, it's actually the Cotman Chinese White. I got confused, but I like this because you can use it as a mixer. It's not a really intense bright white like the titanium white, and it can be layered really nicely. But that is my portrait palette. I wanted it to accommodate a lot of different skin tones, but also have very multi-purpose shades. Everyone has a different skin tone and undertone, and I wanted to accommodate to as many as possible. Obviously, I can bring other tones in for certain portraits that may not be suited with this, but I'm trying to cover all bases with this palette, and I think I can do just that. The next palette is my botanical palette, as I will often, if I'm feeling a bit stressed, I think florals and botanical pieces really do calm me down when I'm painting. So I wanted to have this that I could just bring out as more of like a therapeutic colour palette for me. I do really enjoy florals and botanical pieces for that reason. But moment of appreciation, I wrote the right tone, Winsor & Newton Cotman Chinese White, and I'm just trying to show the different ways that you can layer this. I did a more transparent wash the last time. This is it more layered. I then have another Naples yellow, like I said before. It's a very prominent shade when I'm doing florals. I love that colour for both mixing, but on its own, it's a really buttery sort of colour. And the Maimeri Blue Naples yellow is a really lovely formula as well. I think it's very comparable to the Sennelier. Probably wouldn't need both if you don't use it as much as me, but I like to have it on hand in many different palettes. I then have the Sennelier Lemon Yellow, a really vibrant, cool toned yellow, which I really enjoy using. I then have the Old Holland Scheveningen Yellow Deep, which I like mixing with the lemon yellow to get more of almost a cadmium yellow tone, but also on its own, it's that really rich gold sort of colour. I then have the Schminke Vermilion, which I love as well. Proper fire engine ladybird red, beautiful, beautiful tone. It can be mixed again with a orangey tone to bring it to a more almost pyrrole orange sort of colour. But then I do really like it on its own as well. It's stunning, especially for roses. I then have another newer shade. This is the Winsor & Newton Winsor Red. I kind of wanted this to be the opposite of Vermilion, almost like an alizarin crimson, and it did just that. I can mix them both to get a perfect red, but I've got both sort of tones sorted. I then have my most used floral shade, Old Holland Brilliant Pink, a gorgeous buttery soft pink, beautiful to mix with Naples Yellow to get a peachy tone, but also on its own, probably my favourite watercolour and most used watercolour. We then have the Roman Szmal Cobalt Violet Light, which is very similar to the next shade, but they perform very differently. The Roman Szmal has a little bit more granulation and has a bit more of a pinky magenta hue to it. And the next shade, which is Daniel Smith Wisteria, very similar in tone. It's milkier and it's a bit more of a purer consistency in the sense that it doesn't granulate as much at all. So it's very good for florals that you don't want to have that sort of texture within. I then have the Royal Talens Quinacridone Purple. It's very beautiful to be mixed with the Roman Szmal Cobalt Violet. It has that magenta-y tone, but together they just perform beautifully. And then with that granulation from the Roman Szmal shade, oh, gorgeous. I then have the Schminke Dioxine Violet, which is a more bluer toned instead of the quinacridone sort of colour. It's a great shadow tone for flowers without it being black. You can build it up to almost an inky sort of black colour, but then mixed with the other colours as well. It blends beautifully. Again, quite a pure sort of consistency in the sense that it doesn't granulate. We then have Daniel Smith Lavender, which performs exactly the same as Wisteria, but it has that ultramarine hue to it. It's stunning. Again, a very well used shade. Another massive favourite of mine is the Roman Szmal Shadow Violet Light. It looks like just a normal, almost lighter Payne's grey, but it granulates the most stunning magenta, violet, pink. I remember when I bought it and saw the swatches online, I was like, oh, doesn't look nearly as special as I thought. Went and made myself a cup of coffee, came back and it granulated. I was like, ah, that's why people talk about it. Beautiful, I love it. I then have the Daniel Smith Lunar Black, which is a very granulating black. It's not like it's got any other colours within that, but it does separate beautifully, which I think would go really well, especially in leaves in terms of the botanical pieces that I want to do. I do love the texture that granulating watercolours give, especially in more organic pieces. I then have another Daniel Smith shade, and it's one of my first Daniel Smith shades that I used, and it's the Cascade Green. Now again, one of those shades that looks beautiful as is, but wait for it to dry and all of the greens come out. You have like a perylene base, you have more mustardy tones within, and then turquoises. It's gorgeous. I then have the Roman Szmal Aquarius Chromium Oxide Green, definitely more of a mossy green, so that's why I chose that to pair with the Cascade Green, just so whatever tone the leaf has, I've got it covered. I then have the Sennelier Sepia, perfect for, I really wanted to have almost like decaying colours as well, because I think wilting flowers is also a very beautiful tone. So I wanted to have browns within that, but it can also be used for branches as well. And again, with the wilting theme, I also have the Sennelier Mars Orange, which is a lot more transparent than it looks in the pan. It looks like one of those almost creamy Old Holland shades, but it is very buildable, which I really like, and it has that warmth, but again, still quite a neutral warmth, not like a really bright, vibrant colour. So it can be paired really nicely with neutral tones for leaves, but it can pop also when paired with another vibrant colour. But that is my botanical palette. Just look at those granulations, those undertones. Oh, exquisite. They are absolutely gorgeous. I'm obsessed. I love this colour palette so much. I think it's going to be a very well used one, because all these tones I love using for botanical pieces, but I can also use it for other elements as well. But I think all of those together is just delicious. I love it so much. Now for my landscape palette, again, it provides me a lot of calmness when doing anything nature related, so I wanted to have this palette to hand for that reason, and I chose the Schminke Titanium White because it's slightly brighter and opaque, so I think that would work well in the landscapes, especially for skies and clouds. I then have the Schminke Super Granulating Shire Yellow, which looks like a greeny mustard, but it granulates purple. There's a lot of super granulating shades in this palette for that reason. Absolutely gorgeous. I then have the Super Granulating Tundra Green, may look like an olive, granulates orange. As someone who doesn't understand chemistry and formulas and just appreciates the colours and the aesthetic, it blows my mind. I think it's actual witchcraft. I adore it. I next have the Schminke Spinal Brown, which I originally thought was Spaniel Brown and makes me laugh every time I see it, but it's like a warm terracotta with a bit more of an earthy mustardy tone. A purer in consistency, doesn't really granulate much, which is perfect for what I would like in this palette. We then have the Schminke Super Granulating Galaxy Brown, which is a really lovely mid-tone brown, but then has elements of purple and grey within it, so it's great for adding something a little bit more special and textured within things like soil and bark, that sort of thing. It works beautifully for that. I then have the Maimeri Blue shade in Raw Umber, a purer consistency, again similar to the Spinal Brown, but it's a really transparent brown, so it works well for when you're building up texture and undertones without it making too much of like an opaque colour, and I love that for that reason. Not a special exciting shade, but very versatile and much needed in my colour palette. But if you want another exciting brown, we have Schminke Super Granulating Volcano Brown, which looks like a really deep sepia, slightly greyer and cooler, but then it has this really almost hot pink and really vibrant bright red granulation to it. Beautiful. I then have another super granulating shade, which is kind of the opposite of the Volcano Brown. It's the Schminke Super Granulating in Desert Green. It's a greyer perylene green sort of base, and then when it granulates to almost like a cobalt teal, and then a really bright, vibrant swirl of red. A great way to add interest and dimension into a landscape. I then have the Maimeri Blue Green Gold, which is very similar to undertone of the Shire Yellow, but similar to the other shades. They're purer, so they don't actually have any other colour within it. And it also doesn't granulate, so it's got a bit more of a smoother texture. I bought this shade from Daniel Smith, Apatite Green, when I bought the Cascade Green. Definitely got like a hooker's sap green base, but it does have a very unique granulation. It reminds me of that crackle nail polish that we used to get in our youths. It made us feel very cool, but in terms of a watercolour, it's actually a really interesting texture, and it has reddy browns within it. It's really lovely for that botanical organic sort of colour within the green. I then have the Schminke Perylene Green, which is a very cool toned dark green, a great way to add depth without necessarily using black, especially in like the lusher parts of a landscape like trees and things. It's not a granulating shade, it's smooth, so very good for that reason. I then have the Schminke Super Granulating in Shire Blue. It's a warmer blue, so it has an element of teal within it. And then when it granulates, it's got like limes and yellows, really, really beautiful. I then have my first ever super granulating shade that I ever bought, which was the Schminke Super Granulating Glacier Green. I bought it because I'm a massive fan of turquoise, and then I saw that it granulated pink and I was just blown away. It's like got that potter's pink, really separating sort of shade, but then has that really warm but muted blue. It's a really unique shade. If you're going to get anything from super granulating and you love those sort of tones, I would definitely recommend it. Just look at that. I then have the Sennelier Indigo, which I think would be perfect for adding a bit of depth and coolness to certain elements of a landscape, especially a night sky, but it's also a great way to add a bit more of a different hue within trees and things. I then have the Maimeri Blu Potter's Pink, which is definitely a more warmer and more transparent consistency than what I've used before in a Potter's Pink. But I think I like that for that reason, because I very rarely use it as an opaque colour. I like it as a wash with different things, and the way it granulates is really special as well. I then have a very hyped shade that was actually bought in a bargain bucket in like a independent art store, and I'm so thrilled that I did because it's quite an expensive shade, but it's beautiful. It's a really cool toned violet, and then it has elements of magenta within it. Really, really lovely, especially for sunsets and night skies. I then have the Old Holland Violet Grey, which has that gouache, more opaque consistency that Old Holland tends to have, but a really lovely, cooler blue grey, like a almost pastel Payne's grey. I then have the Schminke Super Granulating Forest Grey, which has an olivey green tone to it, which I really like for that reason. Within landscapes, you can really use that as like a blending shade between the greens and the blacks without it looking too disruptive. There's a nice gradient within it. It granulates all sorts of mustards and greens as well. It's beautiful. I then have the Roman Szmal Gerbish Grey, which I learnt how to pronounce because that spelling is mind-boggling, but it's a beautiful neutral tint sort of base, but then it works very similarly to the Shadow Violet that I swatched in the last palette. It has magentas and blues within it, but has a slightly deeper base than the Shadow Violet. And finally we have Galaxy Black, which is, yep, a black shade, but then it granulates a really dark blue, indigo, ultramarine shade, and has that sort of swirl of Payne's grey as well. I think the Swatches Dry of this colour palette is definitely my favourite. Just look at all those base colours and then mixed with the granulations. It is just it's art in itself. Just the way that they look there is just breathtaking, and I really want to do a landscape now and use this palette because I'm feeling very inspired. I think what interests me especially with this palette is that in the pan they don't necessarily look like anything special. The minute you swatch them though, they just come to life, and that's the best part I think with granulating watercolours, is the unexpected special swirls of colour. And the final palette is something to kind of keep me motivated to try doing more of this, and it's my still life palette. Any paintings I did in school was predominantly still life, and I want to get back into that because I really enjoyed that. I love the composition, the layout, the different things that you can experiment with, from rhythm to reflection, so I'm trying to motivate myself to do more of this. So the first shade I wanted to add to this palette was the Schminke Titanium White Opaque, as a mixer but also as a standalone shade within elements like highlights. I then chose the Winsor & Newton Professional Winsor Blue, another slightly newer tone, hence the almost immaculate pan, but I wanted this kind of like a cadmium yellow, but a slightly brighter cadmium yellow, less orangey, just so I can make it orangey if I want, but also keep it as is as well. I then have the Daniel Smith Goethite, which is a slightly granulating, mustardy brown, kind of like a mix between raw umber and raw sienna. It's a lovely shade, nice and mid-tone, great to mix with elements. I think it'd be good for almost teas and coffees in still life shades, and also books and things. I then have the Schminke Super Granulating Galaxy Brown, which I've swatched before. Again, a warmer, slightly deeper brown than Goethite, but it does have that purpley grey swirl in it, and I think that's beautiful. Again, another element that I can do for wood and things like that within still life pieces. I then have the Schminke Alizarin Crimson, which is a slightly more magenta-based, cooler red, which I think will be lovely as things for fruit and like apples, raspberries, that sort of thing. A purer consistency, so no granulation, which would be great because I can layer over the top of that without disrupting the initial way it looks. To pair with that, if I wanted to make it slightly more orangey, I wanted a more transparent red that also takes a lot of building, so my heavy-handed nature doesn't get too carried away too soon. So for that I chose the Maimeri Blu Permanent Red Light because of that reason. It's nice and transparent, doesn't take a lot of pigment straight away. I then have the Royal Talens Pyrrole Orange. I love this sort of really vibrant orange. I think again for fruit it'd be perfect, but also elements of decoration in flower pots to get that vibrancy, almost reflection from brighter flowers. I then have the Sennelier Grey, a perfect mid-tone grey, neither too light or too dark. It's a lovely creamy consistency as well, quite opaque, which I like for that reason. I then have the Schminke May Green, a really vibrant limey green. I think I predominantly wanted to have colours that would be good for fruit, leaves and flowers because those are my favourite sort of aspects of still life. I then have the Winsor & Newton Professional Hooker's Green Deep. I wanted a really basic mid-tone pure green that neither granulated too much but also didn't compete, and you can also add with blacks and yellows and olives as a really good base, and then you can add mixing shades to make it a little bit more special. I think with still life there's definitely elements that you're trying to capture within a composition that you can't predict, so I think having that shade that you can adapt to that is very important. I then have the Sennelier Ultramarine Deep. It's a gorgeous royal bright blue that is, there's no purple but there's no teal, it's a standard royal blue. I love it, and I think that's going to be really good for decoration within still lifes but also good for undertones as well. Then the pastel variant of Ultramarine, which is the Ultramarine Light, very similar to the Daniel Smith Lavender. So that's why I've popped it in this palette, just to have a bit more of a difference, but it's really lovely for anything, an added coolness or blueness, for example in a reflection, without actually compromising the value either. The next colour is from Szmal and it's Mineral Violet. It just looks like a normal dark scene violet or anything that's somewhat blue violet, and then when it granulates it has, again, hot pink, magenta. I was a thing of a hot pink magenta granulation. What can I say? Szmal paints are lovely. They do have that really exquisite granulation without being massively expensive either. There are some slightly higher priced variants of the paints, but then you do have some fabulous shades for a very affordable price as well. And a lot for your money also, full pans, although they have started doing half pans as well now, which is very exciting. I often run out of space very quickly for my watercolours, so having half pans of the lovely formula of Szmal means that I still get to have the lovely paints without having to sacrifice a lot of space in my palettes. The next shade is from Sennelier and it's Sap Green, so it's a slightly more yellow olive based green but does have a slight more lighter value to it, which is nice for when you want to add the nice green base, but then can go into it with other materials as well to get things a bit darker. We then have Sennelier's Viridian, which is a lot more transparent. It has that really lovely, very light opacity. So it's great for building things up or as a wash, not so much if you're wanting intense pigment. We then have Maimeri Blu's Cobalt Teal, which is my favourite turquoise. It's very pure, not too much granulation at all, but it does have some nice colour within that can be nice to be mixed into other colours as well. I then have Sennelier's Cyanine Blue, which is similar to Ultramarine. Well, it's basically like if Ultramarine and Viridian had a baby. It's beautiful, and I think it's a nice way to add a bit of depth without actually compromising the sort of tealy vibes. I think Ultramarine would definitely make things a lot more darker and more kind of primary, whereas the Cyanine does have that nice warmth to it as well. I then popped Daniel Smith's Jane's Grey in this palette because it's a slightly deeper, almost black shade. It has a bit of coolness. It's a slightly lilac-y version of Payne's Grey, I'm guessing, is why they've called it Jane's Grey, but I love it. A great way to add shadow and depth like a graphite pencil would. And finally we have Old Holland's Scheveningen Black Intense, which, as the name suggests, it's a very dark, very intense black, but due to it being the Old Holland variety, it's a lovely opacity, a nice thicker viscosity as well, so a bit gouache, but it can blend out beautifully as a nice soft grey as well, but then really gives that pigment and depth to a painting as well, so very important for creating shadows within still life pieces of overlap and whatnot with all the different pieces in a composition. And that is my curated still life palette. It's really inspiring me, even though I've had all these colours before. For some reason, seeing them all together has given me loads of ideas of some compositions I want to lay out and then paint. I want to explore things that I really enjoyed when I was a lot younger in school doing art, and then apply what I've learned from being an artist full time and in other career paths within art being used that I've done. So I'm just really looking forward to developing those skills, but also seeing how I differ in terms of the way that I paint and how my style has changed and adapted and whatnot. But that is the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video or like me, please do subscribe to my channel. I would love to have you here and join me in all of my arty endeavours. I feel like I'm finally coming back after a bit of a wobble. Unfortunately, I had a reaction to some medication that I didn't think I could be allergic to because I had taken it before, but I actually was allergic to it. And it's not been very pleasant, so I'm going to actually include that in a health update at some point because I've had a lot of new updates and still more to come as well. So I think having things up to date in that respect would be something I'd like to do. So if there's any questions that you'd like to know about the conditions that I have, or the process of how I get diagnosed, or how things are day to day as someone who's chronically ill, then please do leave them below as well. I know a couple of you have chronic illnesses yourself, so I don't mind sharing how I cope with things, and hopefully it might help you as well, because it is a very isolating experience. It's horrible, and if we all stick together and look after each other, I think that's really important, because loneliness is one of the worst almost symptoms of chronic illnesses because not many people can relate, but that's something I'm passionate about. I digress. I'm off to make another order of crochet hooks because they have been remarkably popular, which has been lovely because I do love making them, and being a Van Gogh enthusiast myself, I really enjoy it. But they need to be posted tomorrow, so I'm going to continue making them and get them sorted. But I'm going to love you and leave you because I've also got a wedding that I'm going to this weekend, which I need to rest for because my sleep has been awful. I want to make sure I can get through it without having to worry about my stamina. But I am waffling again. I do this so well, but thank you so much for watching. I really hope you have a truly magical rest of your day. Please stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!